All right, so this one is one of the appendices in the back, and it is the most often asked question within apologetics. Actually, any religion, any belief system, we has to come up with an answer for this if they want their beliefs to be fitting with the reality around them. So it's not just for Christians. But when I first started doing this, I would put current events up there. What we have up there is the Texas and the Las Vegas shootings. You remember those two, somewhat recent. And I kind of got like, I put the Boston bombing up sometimes. Of course, 9/11 is a big one to put up there. But there have been so many tragedies that you can't even keep up with current events. It struck me that, tragedies of people freaking out and killing a bunch of people. Of course, tragedies like Katrina and natural disasters, even the tornadoes that happened yesterday. So there's always something to put up there. And that was just sobering to me for whatever reason. The problem of evil can be stated in different ways. You can say there's a problem of evil, like evil exists, God wouldn't let evil exist, therefore there can't be a God. We'll go through their actual arguments. But it sometimes will be said, the problem of suffering, the problem of pain. God loves me, he wouldn't let me go through this. If God loved me, he wouldn't take my mom or dad at a young age, or a spouse. He wouldn't take our friends with cancer. If God was love, he wouldn't do these things. So it's a very personal suffering. Sometimes it's more abstract, like the inconsistencies logically of God and evil existing. So whatever way somebody says it, everything we're going to do tonight, I think, covers it. However the question or the objection is phrased, you can usually just turn it into, so you don't think there's a compatibility with bad things happening and God existing. Whether it's to you personally or in general, or some people will just stick with there can't be a God if there's a Satan, because God wouldn't let Satan fall away and do what he did. However, when you're dealing with these questions, that is a family of objections, and they're called the problem of evil. Most people, I find, that when they bring up these, they're not actually making an intellectual argument. They're not saying, well, tell me your reasons for why you think God exists, if there's evil. Help me work through this intellectually. It's almost always an emotional outcry, or kind of shaking our fist at God because of what he let happen. Even if he didn't cause it, he still allows things to happen. We have to be okay with that, because that's more than anything, that's what we experience day in and day out, is that there's suffering, there's pain, there's hard times, and there's really, really, really hard times, disasters. So God allows it to happen, and we don't like it. And so when you're talking with somebody, I think it's just really helpful to ask them that question, like, so are you thinking through this on sort of a philosophical level, where you're wondering how could it be possible, or are you hurting? Because if you're hurting, I'm right there with you, and I think really the only thing I can give you is a shoulder to cry on. That's what you need, not arguments. But if you're interested in working through this issue, then let's work through it. And the stuff I'm going to do tonight is all of that. This is the intellectual handling, or the philosophical handling of the issue of evil. But sometimes, many times, what they need is just a listening ear and a shoulder to cry on. So we have to be sensitive to that, because what we're trying to get to is a gospel presentation. But I will say, the intellectual and the emotional problem of evil are not disconnected. There is an overlap with you understanding, or being, at least having some peace about how it could be that God is good and God is all-powerful, and I still suffer the way I do. You can get through mourning, easier isn't the right word, maybe quicker, or with more satisfaction or more peace as you're mourning, as you're suffering. It does make a difference. I can say I think sometimes Christian apologists, they are too dismissive of the value of the intellectual, because they want to sound like they're compassionate. So they say, the intellectual is totally different than the emotional. But it does intersect. So that's what I'll say in terms of introduction. So we'll jump in. Here is the problem as it's stated. And like I said, it can be formulated in various ways, but it's essentially this. Why is there so much suffering in the world? So it could be, yeah, I can see God existing in some suffering, but when you look at, especially some third world nations, if you look at God allowing the massacres that he's allowed, or the mudslides, earthquakes, or natural disasters and man-made evils, it's a lot. I mean, it's not just a small thing. And regular 24-hour news cycles has made it even more in our face, where we can't hide from it. Maybe we could have years ago, but it's right there. Sometimes just the question of, if there's God, why is there evil? God just didn't see it coming? Was he not strong enough to hold evil back? Why do bad things happen to good people? Interesting thing to say here. Bill Craig said this one time. I thought, that's really good. He says, I don't understand why, if you claim that this is an intellectual objection, and you say, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? And you're saying that there's some incompatibility with bad things and good people. It's also equally, if you're right, incompatible to say, why do good things happen to bad people? Why don't you have a problem with that if it truly is an intellectual objection? Really what you're saying is, I'm a good person and bad things happen to me. What the heck? How come God lets that happen? That's what you really mean. And that's a fair sentiment, and I share it. Why, God? And that's what Job, the whole book of Job is, why God, why God? And he never answers Job. That's the interesting thing, is we know what the deal was in heaven with Lucifer, with Satan, but we have no idea why God cut that deal. I mean, he doesn't get explained why he let Satan do that. We know the mechanics behind the scenes, but we as a reader are no better off in terms of knowing why than Job was. So that's what's kind of cool about the book that I think is overlooked. A very important thing I think to point out is, this is not a problem. This is not a Christian apologetic problem. No matter what you believe about deeper things, atheism, Buddhism, whatever, you have to have an answer to this, because all of us suffer. So Buddhism, for example, if you know the story of Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama was the first Buddha that they say, the enlightened one. He was a Hindu, grew up in Hinduism in India, and he was from a privileged family, so he had silver spoon type thing. And one day he decided to go out and look and hang out with the masses, and he saw mass suffering. And he's like, so he started reflecting on their suffering, and then looking at his life, he says, well, I suffer. Everyone seems to suffer. What is the purpose of suffering? And the whole religion of Buddhism is actually an answer to the problem of evil. Suffering is an illusion. All reality is an illusion. And you suffer because you think this illusion is real. And that ties you emotionally to this world, in relationships or in desires, or wanting money or wealth or healthy body, whatever. These desires are illusions. And because you have these desires, that's why you suffer. The entire religion of Buddhism is a response to, why is there evil, interestingly. We did Buddhism another time, but it's a very interesting religion to me. Darwinism, you remember the story, he went on a ship voyage and collected samples and developed his theory. In between that time and him publishing, he lost a young child, and so it was very hard for him. He also, just like a lot of people in the 1700s and 1800s, he lost people. Death was more common. They were dying from more than the coronavirus, and they were dying from flus and things like that. So death was, he looked around and he said, I'm sad because this child died, my child died, my love. There must not be a God, at least not a God who cares. And then he looked in the animal kingdom and he saw just as much, quote, suffering. I don't think animals suffer like humans suffer. I think it's a different thing altogether. But he didn't. And he said, all I see everywhere is death, survival of the fittest. There can't be a God. Let me try to explain the way things work without God. So his whole project was in answer to, why is there evil? The Greek polytheon, what do you call it? Yeah, Polygon. Is that what it's called? Pantheon. Pantheon gods, that's what it is. They thought of, okay, something's happening bad to me, it's because Zeus is up there just having a temper tantrum, or he wanted to show off to Aphrodite. So they actually thought that the gods were up there just willy-nilly doing stuff with their action figures here down on Earth, basically. It was childish, almost, a view of their gods, but they were capricious, they had temper tantrum, things like that, but they also had a lot of power, so it caused a lot of trouble. Thor, Thor's having a temper tantrum, that's why we have a massive storm at sea right now, with the thunder, and then Poseidon with the water. So that isn't why they thought there were these gods, but that's their answer to the problem of evil. Why is there suffering? Because the gods are mad or negligent or whatever they are. They need to be appeased, and hopefully they'll change their minds. So every belief system has to come up with an answer, and those are just a sampling of what some of them have come up with. Defining the problem of evil. Okay, there are two types of evil that get brought up, and they really should be handled differently, separately, I mean, but it always comes back to we're putting God on the seat, the witness seat, and we're saying, why did you let this happen? You have to defend yourself, God. So natural evil would mean earthquakes and landslides and hurricanes and tornadoes like yesterday. Was it yesterday or 2 days ago? 2 days ago, I think. Yeah. Was it Monday?
It's midnight. Right
Yeah,
after midnight.
I think it was overnight, Monday to Tuesday, because I talked to someone from Tennessee yesterday. So that's an example of natural evil, where nobody did anything immoral to have a tornado touch down and destroy their home and kill them. I think they had 9 people die, was it?
It's like 22 right now.
22.
22 is going up.
It's going up, and they're still missing over 20 people.
So it's lives affected for, they just went to bed that night, they didn't do anything wrong. That's what we mean by natural evil. Moral evil would be Adolf Hitler. So Adolf Hitler murdered 6 million Jews and was responsible for the death of 12 million people if you count the whole World War II body count. That was him deciding to do some really evil stuff. So in the first case, God, why did you directly do that with a tornado or a hurricane or earthquake? In the second case, it's God, why did you allow that to do that? God, you could have killed Hitler as a baby. You could. It's easy. We can imagine ways of stopping the Holocaust, for example. And then the outrage is sort of, if I can imagine it as a fallible human, what's wrong with you, God? And so, as a Christian, this is getting to the emotional side, I think that God wants us, if that's what's in our heart, He wants us to say that to Him. But be prepared for the answer He's going to give you, like He did for Job. Because you think about the book of Job, He let Job and his friends, blah, 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 they were sounding off long soliloquies. Those are long chapters. It's poetry, I know, but they were babbling, and they were out, here's why, and God just patiently sat there. And finally, what did He do? He goes, okay, you ready? You ready for me to talk? Can I talk now? All right, sit down. You're about to go to school. And He says, I am the God, the Creator. I am the one that holds all this in existence. You're a creature. Who are you to tell your Creator that He did something wrong? And He just puts him in his place and doesn't answer him. It's a great chapter in that I think we all need to go there. And sometimes it's almost like God knows what's in our heart, and when we walk around like, I'm happy, I'm not mad at God because of this bad thing that happened, I'm sad, but I'm not mad at God, but we really are. God would rather have us telling Him off than lying. And that's why I love that, when I did that movie talk, that scene where, Forrest Gump, where Lieutenant Dan is up on top of the crow's nest, and he's just yelling at God, just screaming, and God's up there. You get a sense of like, okay, all right, Dan, that's what I wanted from you. And then later on, He says He made His peace with God. That is the problem of evil. That's one of the themes from that movie. Why did bad things happen? And how do we react to it? So we're going to cover both of those. But I will say this about natural evil. Think about an earthquake. I've mentioned this in class before in other contexts, but here is where it matters, I think, most. An earthquake in California at magnitude 6, and you hear about massive damage to property, some traffic accidents maybe, but how often do we hear about mass deaths, or any deaths really, because of an earthquake in California? I can't remember the last time I heard about Americans dying from earthquakes. Now, think about the earthquakes in Haiti or Honduras, you know, in our region even, you can go anywhere to, you know, think about it, but around the world, but in our region here, the Caribbean, you think about those earthquakes and thousands of people dead. Hundreds dead, tens of thousands influenced. I mean, it's massive. What's the difference?
Economics.
Well, even behind that, right, what you're, I think, meaning there is that their construction codes are not either observed or even in place. People take bribes. Construction companies will take a bribe and not put as much concrete in, or do, you know, to cut corners to save money, and they pocket the difference. And so there's a moral component, is the point. So even when we say, how did God let that happen in Haiti? Yes, the earthquake, God, we don't have hardly anything unless you believe in, like, climate change is responsible for every single thing, you know, some as crazy as that. Even they don't think we're responsible for every single earthquake or hurricane or tornado. So that's in God's lap. Why did you design the universe in this way? But it should be asked, well, wait a second, what about those people who are culpable, who didn't love their neighbor enough to say, no, I'm not going to take a bribe, I'm going to do this right. When I was in Peru, I worked for South American Mission. We went to Peru. I wasn't a missionary, nothing so holy as that. I was just working at headquarters doing fundraising. They sent me down there to kind of see what was going on and be able to talk about it with donors back home. So we did a tour around, and they showed me this road that a friend that I was with had been a missionary in the same town for a long time as a pilot. And he said, the whole time I was here, this was a dirt road with potholes and, you know, all the way from here to Lima. It was horrible, hundreds or thousands of miles actually, because it's way inland in Pucallpa. And he said, but now it was paved and everyone was super happy because it kind of was the first connecting of two cities in Peru. And he said that when they hired, the company that won the bid was a Brazilian company. And apparently Brazil has for a long time been trying to get more westernized and adopt more Western values that compared to like Venezuela or these other countries that are, you know, kind of going off either sort of socialism or you know, native religions or whatever. And they tried to bribe this company, the locals, because you're supposed to be, I think it had to be 6 inches thick, and they said, you make it 4 inches thick, I'll look the other way, I'll say it's okay, and we'll split the difference that you save. You'll save tens of thousands of dollars if you do that, and we'll split the difference. And they refused to do it. They got in a lot of trouble because they refused to do it. They said, no, we want our name to, we want people to know that we do it. That principle of standing behind your work and having pride in what you do and loving your neighbor. Like I know if I do 4 inches and the first mudslide that comes through, this road is going to collapse and people will die or be stranded or whatever, I'm not going to do that. So there is a moral component to natural evils. One of my favorite movies is the movie Shadowlands. I did see the BBC version of it, at least the second half of it, and it was okay. But this one, if you haven't seen it yet, Anthony Hopkins plays C.S. Lewis, and Deborah Winger plays his wife. Real quick, the true story, it is a true story. C.S. Lewis did not get married until his mid-50s. Was a bachelor his whole life. I'm not sure why, just stuffy British professor. I don't know what the reason was, but he never got married until he meets this American divorcee who is ethnically Jewish, actually, and even had some leanings. She participated in some communist rallies in college, and she said, "Well, it's just because I thought if you weren't a Nazi, you had to be a communist, because that was." So that's the story of who she was. She, of course, was a Christian by this time that they met, and she was a fan of his books, and they ended up meeting because of that. They corresponded through the mail, and he fell in love and married her. He married her, though, after, because while they were courting and falling in love, discovered she had bone cancer. And it was very aggressive, and this was the 1950s, so it wasn't a lot of hope. Then he decided to marry her, knowing that her time was short. And so this movie, Shadowlands, is their love story, how they met, how they fell in love, how they decided to get married, and then watching her die. So the whole movie is it's kind of, why do you like these movies, Eric? It's crazy. I love it because it's C.S. Lewis, who's a great thinker in the Christian faith, having to deal with something very real that we all have to deal with. And tons of great quotes in there. But at the beginning of the movie, has anybody read his books? He has 2 books on suffering and pain. One's just called The Problem of Pain. You read that? Worth
Saw
a
the
read.
movie.
Great movie, right? You remember the beginning when he was lecturing to I think it was a women's club or something, he was just giving this lecture. It was very intellectual. That was directly from his book, Problem of Pain. And he says in that book, this is when he was a little bit younger that he wrote this, and he said, look, this is an intellectual handling of the problem of pain. This doesn't mean I'm like Mr. Tough Guy. He says, I'll cry like a baby whenever I'm in pain myself. So I'm not claiming that I'm tough. I suffer like anybody, but let's just deal with it intellectually, is what he says. So, and then he lays it out. It's a great book. But there's a second book that he wrote. It actually was his journal entries that were compiled. And I don't know for sure if he knew, because it was published either at or near or after his death. Because he died shortly after her. You know what day he died? Trivia. Do you know who else died the same day C.S. Lewis died?
Billy Graham.
JFK's assassination.
Mm.
And Aldous Huxley, a famous atheist, humanist, died that day too. 3 huge figures, but because
The exact same day.
Exact
Not an
same day.
anniversary of the day.
same day,
Oh, wow.
1963. Yep. So a lot of people have speculated, or just, maybe God just wanted C.S. Lewis to kind of go off in the sunset because no one even noticed. We were all, people were all thinking about JFK. Next thing you know, like, hey, where's that guy who wrote those Narnia books? He died? What? There's a book called it says something about heaven, and it's a fictitious story of these 3 people who represent 3 different worldviews stand before God. And they're like waiting to go before God in the waiting room, and they're talking with one another. So Huxley and Lewis and Kennedy. It's interesting. I've only heard the Cliff Notes version of it, but it's just really created a way to contrast worldviews, a Catholic worldview, an evangelical one, and a humanist, or I don't know if he was an atheist, but he was definitely a humanist. So, a little background information on that. I highly recommend the movie if you haven't seen it. The beginning of the movie is him saying things like, I think it is irrational that God would permit suffering and evil. That is an intellectual objection to evil. So if someone says, I don't think God's existence and suffering and evil's existence are compatible, it's irrational and illogical, they're making an intellectual case. And that's what C.S. Lewis combated in The Problem of Pain, and does a great job. I think it just like what he did in Mere Christianity, he just is so eloquent. By the time you're done reading, you're like, yeah, well, where are you going to go from here if you are against him? But there's a difference, because at the end of the movie, after his wife dies, she had 2 sons, and in this movie they represented only one son because, I don't know if you know the story, but Douglas Gresham, who's in the movie, is a born-again Christian, and he's the one who executive produces C.S. Lewis's movies. He owns the estate, and so he has all the intellectual property rights for Narnia and all that, and he's a believer. The other son, David Gresham, kept the Jewish faith, maybe even a non-believing version, but he did not accept Christianity. And so he did not give them permission to represent him in the movie. So that's why they make it just one child in the movie. Little side note there, movie trivia. But them together have to deal with the suffering and pain. So at the beginning of the movie, he's answering the question, I think it is irrational that God would permit suffering and evil. But at the end, I don't like a God who would permit suffering and evil. That's the emotional argument, or the emotional problem of evil. And so Lewis, I think the best way is in A Grief Observed, you read that he is lashing out at God, I don't think at all in a disrespectful, irreverent way. He's just being honest. This is how I feel. This is what I'm thinking. Where do you get off making this happen? Because he was struggling with, why did you even bring her in my life? I was 55 years old. I was perfectly happy being a bachelor to my grave, and you made me love. And so he was wrestling with a lot of internal battles. So he was wrestling with, I don't like you, God. I'm mad at you. But by the end of the book, you see him go from that state to, I don't like it. I don't like that you let this happen, but I trust you. And if you remember back in his Narnia books, before he even knew his wife, but this was his philosophy, when the children first heard that Aslan's a lion, and remember what Weber said? He said, well, first of all, I can't remember which Pevensey child asked it. He said, lion? Is he safe? Because, their experience of lions is they're going to eat humans. And Beaver, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver chuckles, and they say, no, he's not safe, but he's good. So that's C.S. Lewis's view of God. He's not safe in the sense that he's not here to arrange our cage like we're hamsters, and he changes out our shavings and replaces the water when necessary and just makes a comfortable life for us until he calls us home to heaven. That's not what this life is about. It's about finding him, knowing him, growing in him, storing treasures in heaven, more just as importantly maybe, getting others to know him through our actions and words down here. That's why we're here. We're not hamsters in a cage. This life is not all there is. So when he did that, the only thing you can do when somebody is at that state is hug them, cry. Just what he's doing there with his son. That scene right there, he just said, I can't remember, I think he said, I miss her. Why did she have to die? And he said, I don't know. The boy starts crying, and Lewis starts crying. If you don't cry in that scene, then you're heartless. But like I said, the crying is going to come, but having a grounding on the intellectual questions is a therapy of sorts. And C.S. Lewis, as you read Grief Observed, you can see that. So I highly recommend. In fact, what you should do is read Problem of Pain, watch the movie, then read Grief Observed. And you'll need therapy because you'll be so happy. Did I ever tell you that the 3 movies I saw in a 1 week span? I was working at a movie theater, and my roommate was working at a Blockbuster. You remember those? These things called VHS tapes that we used to put in. So we had all the movies we could handle for free. We could go to movies as much as we wanted. You could rent whatever we wanted. So in 1 week time, I saw Shadowlands, Schindler's List, and there was a movie called My Life with Michael Keaton. You remember that? Kind of came and went, but it was a movie about a man dying of cancer. Yeah, and his wife's pregnant, and so the whole movie is him making video recordings, talking to his unborn child. I'm not going to be there for you, but let me teach you about this, about that. He ends up living long enough to see, but he dies in the end. Heart-wrenching. I saw all 3 of those in 1 week. And I realized that's stupid, number one, but I need to just never do that again. So anyway, that was a tough week. So I don't recommend reading it, like I said, but give yourself space in between. So the intellectual problem of evil is saying that there's a logical contradiction between those 2 statements. That an all-loving God and all-powerful God exists, that statement, and suffering exists. They say that's illogical. That violates the law of non-contradiction, excluded middle. They're going to get very philosophical. It cannot be that an all-loving, all-powerful God exists and suffering exists. But in order to do that, there's nothing about that syllogism that's it's not a valid objection. Valid means that if something's invalid, whether the conclusion is true or not, there's some broken rule of logic. So if you say all chairs are brown, if the chair is brown, then the sky is blue. And the chair is brown, therefore the sky is blue. Okay. The sky is blue, so the conclusion is true. But is there any logic? Have I shown a necessary if-then? No, you've broken the law of logic. The atheist is trying, some atheists, actually the minority of atheists, are saying that it's illogical for God to exist and evil and suffering to exist. So they have to, someone who wants to hold to this has to unpack it a little bit more. They have some hidden assumptions in that argument. What they're saying is if an all-powerful God exists, then he can create any world that he wants. And if an all-loving God exists, then he prefers a world without suffering. So it's possible for him to create any world he wants. And if he's loving, he would want to make a world without suffering. So that's what they have behind there when they say that all-powerful, all-loving God can't exist and also have suffering. Does that make sense, what they're hiding in there? So the question is, are these legitimate, these two statements? And that's what we're going to go through next. First of all, what is evil to begin with? That you have to answer the question if you're going to say God and evil can't both exist. What do you mean by God? What do you mean by evil? So oftentimes you'll think the answer will come back and it'll be a God that we don't believe in. It'll be some sort of like Zeus type God. So yeah, that kind of God and evil can't both exist maybe. But what do you mean by God? What is evil? Privation. Evil is a privation. I'll unpack it more later, but you know what a privation is? I mean, if you've been...
Lacking of something.
Right. It's a lack. It's an absence of something. So a shadow is not really a thing. You can't take a shadow, pick it up, and put it in the test tube or whatever. What do we mean when we say there's a shadow? That there's something that's blocking light from hitting something else. It's an absence of light, a privation of light. You can talk about it intelligently. You can say, here's the shape of the shadow, here's what a shadow is, it's the absence of light and all that. But you're still not talking about something that's really a thing. That's what evil actually is. You can talk about evil intelligently, but what is evil itself? It's not a thing. And what do I mean by that? Okay, if God created all things and evil is a thing, then that means God created evil. But if God did not create evil, then it's either unreal or it's not a thing. Nobody is going to say that evil's unreal. Maybe Buddhists would. They would say it's an illusion. That is something I think that they would probably hold to. But we want to deny the second thing. Evil is not a thing. And that means that first statement, if God created all things and then God created evil, it's false, because evil doesn't fall in that first category of things. God can't make anything evil because it violates his nature, who he is. He can't do anything that violates his nature. He can't lie, he can't not love, he can't create evil. He can't, I won't go into that because that's a whole other thing. Free will is a messy thing too, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. So there's a difference between being nothing and not being a thing. So like I said, evil is real in the sense that we can talk about it like we can talk about a shadow. But it still doesn't mean it's a thing. We're still talking, in any term, when you really think about it, every evil act, what you ultimately will come to is that person should have done this and they didn't. So there's a privation of something they should have done, right? That's what's evil. When we see natural evil, like a child born with missing an organ that ends up, they die in the first week, they literally had a privation of an organ. And we would say that's evil. That's an evil occurrence. Yes, it was. And you're actually talking about something. You're talking about it as something that exists, but it's not a thing. Am I making sense? I want to sound like I'm double talking, but it's important to make that distinction. Augustine was the first one to reason along these lines. At least the first one to write it down. And he used those analogies of light, shadow, and said that there's no difference. There's no problem with there being a God and there being evil, because what we mean by evil is actually the absence of what God intends for that thing. That is evil. The illustration of evil that he used would be blindness. So, is blindness the thing? Describe blindness without talking about sight. You can't do it, because that's all blindness is. But blindness in a rock is not evil. So this gets back to, you remember when we did the teleological argument for God or the design argument for God? This gets back to everything has a nature that's created by God. And so when you say that's a good cow, what you mean is that it produces milk, it eats grass, it makes a good hamburger, you could say that, or a good meal for a lion. And you could mean that it's a good cow in all those senses. Because it's fulfilling why God made it. A rock, God did not make rocks to see, so when we say a rock can't see, that's not blindness. A person is supposed to see. So you would say that is a natural evil when a person is lacking sight is not a good thing. Similar to, this can kind of bleed over a little bit into the transgender or gender confusion debate. If somebody, I referenced him before, at the time we were super good friends. We keep in touch on Facebook now, but can't say, they're up in Michigan, we're down here, so we haven't stayed super tight. But we were tight at this time when they had their firstborn. And they announced to everyone that their daughter had arrived. And then a couple days later, they announced they were talking about their son. We were like, what? We missed, it wasn't Facebook day, so you had to call up people and, what's going on? And he was a hermaphrodite. He is a hermaphrodite. He was born with his male genitalia inside, and female genitalia was what was exposed. So visually, it was, okay, this is a daughter. And the doctor said, we can surgically and with hormone therapy direct this child either direction, because he has all the plumbing for both. So what do you guys want to do? And so we were in their small group, and so we talked about it. And the best I knew how to say, I didn't know about natures or anything back then. I said, what is he chromosomally? And they said he's a male, he's XY. Someday, if you choose not to tell him all along, which probably shouldn't, but someday you're gonna have this conversation with your child. You need him to have something that he can hold on to and say, okay, I know I'm a male, right down to my chromosome. Even with all these other problems that came because of my birth defect, I am a male. That's really important. So a privation, in his case, is single gender genitalia. He's missing something that he should have, which is gender certainty, I guess you would say. That's a natural evil. Someone born without an arm would be the same thing. But this argument we're putting together here, see how it relies on teleology, which has impact on the transgender argument. Gender fluidity, I can be this or be that. No, you can't, because you are what you are. You are privating yourself. If you're a male and you choose to be a female and you have all the surgeries to maim your body and all that, you have just privated yourself. And that isn't evil against you, that you've committed. It's not someone else committing it to you. That's our argument against transgenderism, one of the more profound arguments. And interestingly, all you need to demonstrate that is Aristotle's writings. You don't even need to quote Bible verses to show that there is something about being human that you ought to be, and you've just violated that. And another biblical example would be when Jesus was at the tomb of Lazarus. You remember the story. Jesus purposely waited for him to die. They came and said, he's sick, come see your friend, come see your friend. He's your friend, right? Don't you want to help him? You heal everybody else, why don't you heal him? And it says he delayed waiting for him to die. So if it was Jesus' choice to allow him to die at that time, knowing all the sadness that would come, why does it say Jesus wept? Why would he weep? It was his choice, and he knew he would be seeing Lazarus in a few minutes. Why do we cry at funerals? Because it's a loss. Jesus is the cause of it because he let it happen intentionally, and there's no loss of his friend because he's about to see him in a few minutes, and it's going to be this huge celebration. So what does it mean Jesus wept? And I never thought that was an issue until I heard Larry Crabb talking about it in his book Finding God, and he said the Greek word wept there are different words you could say for crying. This one has a little bit of anger implied in it, like how you can weep because you're mad that something happened, or you can just be broken and weep. Or there are different types of crying. Crying of a romantic movie, that's a different kind of tear than this. And the way Larry Crabb says it, and I checked with our theologians who teach Hebrew and Greek, and I'm always checking things that I used to believe before seminary, like, is this legit? And they said, yeah, that's a fair way to summarize it. It's not in the text, but it's fair. And what he said is this: Jesus wept because he saw death, crying, and mourning, and that's not what we were supposed to experience. He knew that humans, our teleology is to live forever in our bodies. And so when he was there, it just struck him in his humanity in a way that he hadn't for a long time, apparently, that I didn't make it like this. I made it perfect. And this stinks. And I'm a little bit upset about that. That makes total sense. That Jesus would do that. So what do we answer? Okay, what are our options? I put classical theist in there because for those of you who've gone through the Doctrine of God, divine attributes, that's classical theism. Things that pretty much every Christian believed about God prior to modern philosophy and theology kind of following modern philosophy and turning it into the divine guy in the sky, big guy in the sky. So God's knowledge is exactly like human knowledge, just big. His power is exactly like our power, just big. That's not the classical God. So that's why I put classical theists in there, because I think that's important, that especially when you're talking about the problem of evil. We don't want to paint a picture of a God who's up there trying the best he can, but he's, after all, there's all his free will he's got to deal with, and that's called open theism. He doesn't know the future. He's not completely all-powerful to stop evil. So they just say, well, he's trying the best that he can. One is that God's plan for the world is inscrutable. We're not God. This is kind of the end of Job. God's saying, I'm God, you're not. Just going to have to rest in that. Not only am I God and you're not in the sense of power, I'm God and you're not in the sense that I am love. So you trust in me in the love and be humble before me in the power. So when we see God for who he is, it does help us through things. It's not an answer to why God let this particular thing happen at this time, but we don't know why. There's no logical incompatibility there. A perfect world is a logic impossibility. That I'll go through more later, but think about that one. The logical impossibility. And if that's the case, can God make square circles or married bachelors? God can't create those things. Well, what are we saying? God has limitations in his creative power? That means God's not all powerful. God, the phrase God is all powerful does not mean God can do anything. It means he can do anything that's consistent with his nature. So he can't lie, he can't not love us, he can't create a contradiction, because he in himself, remember the laws of thought, flow from who he is. I am that I am, meaning I'm not what I am. That is the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity. We actually are talking about God when we talk about the laws of thought, or logic. So he cannot create a world that's perfect in the sense that we all mean, meaning free creatures, living forever, and not sinning and suffering. Those are incompatible, is what we're saying. The greater goods, soul-making theodicy. If you're interested in this, the guy's name is John Hick. I don't like it that much, but it's an option. Basically, suffering gives you crowns in heaven, and on the other side of the grave, you're going to be like, oh, okay, it was worth it, because this is awesome. This is so much better, and I'm experiencing heaven in an even greater way because of the suffering I went through. The free will defense, which I do hold to, but not everybody at SES actually does, interestingly. Basically, they accept it, and I'll go through that. I think this is the best one, easiest to understand at least. And then the natural order defense of C.S. Lewis. So the natural order defense of Lewis is God created humans with free will. The responsible exercise of free will requires a world of non-capricious physical regularities. In other words, there has to be rules in the physical world. Otherwise, what does it mean to choose? So to choose to eat versus not to eat, there has to be some physical law about your body needing physical sustenance and not eating poison. These things that are baked into the natural world. So C.S. Lewis would have, I think he would have even said that Adam and Eve would have died naturally if they hadn't have eaten the fruit. I would say that God, to be human is to be finite, which means that the possibility of dying is always there. But God supernaturally kept them immortal, and the curse was him lifting that. Like, I'm not going to do that for you. I haven't let the animals live forever. I have been letting you live forever, but now I'm not. You're going to be like them, and you have to suffer. And even how you get your food is going to be harder. I used to make it really easy for you. Now, those thorns that you've seen out there that used to not bug you, I'm going to make them come into your crops now, make it really hard for you. So he didn't. That's how I believe. C.S. Lewis was a little more liberal, actually. these regulators create the possibility of natural evil. So we're free, there have to be consequences to our actions. In other words, he would say if Adam and Eve had jumped off a cliff, they would have died. Because there are physical laws of gravity and inertia and their biology that he had to have physical laws in order for them to choose the right things. And I think this is a good one. The only problem is, I think that to be biblical, not philosophical now that we've done the good philosophy, to be biblical, it seems like Adam and Eve couldn't have died prior to eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What does that mean, though? I think, like I said, they were mortal, supernaturally kept immortal by God. Otherwise, they would have been recreated as new things after the curse. Imagine they were immortal in their bodies, and then they're outside the garden, and they're mortal in their bodies. Then they're not the same thing. What does it mean to be human? Remember that human nature? We talked about animals in Romans 5:12. Adam pre-fall, Adam post-fall had to be human, with no difference in the term human. Adam and Jesus both had to be human, with no difference in the term human. And we have to be human in that sense. And that is how original sin and the curse passes through, and that's most importantly how redemption passes. That's what Jesus redeemed. That's why his salvation is for all men, all humans. Then you have to choose it to make it mean something for you. But human nature has been, the sin's been paid for. That raise any heresy flags for anybody? Because there's more there, but that's the top level way of saying it. And I think that's the most consistent with the biblical narrative. So in the consummation of history, all will be good. So at the end, all will be good, meaning all good things, all good deeds will be rewarded, and that's a good. So Mother Teresa doing what she did to the poor, the Kurds in Calcutta, that will be rewarded. Of course, she's rewarded now, but they're talking just at the end of your life, at the end. But at the end of all history, it seems like there'll be one final reckoning of good and evil, and that's a good. But also, all evils will be punished, and the punishing of evil is a good. When God is just, we would say that is good. That's what we mean by you're a good God, you're a just God, and we kind of use those two terms interchangeably. So that's the consummation of history argument, that in the end it all works out. The free will defense that I didn't elaborate on is that if a human is free, okay, let me back up. God wanted us to love him and love each other. God is love, so he doesn't need it. He's perfect, he's content in who he is. But it's good for us to love him, the source of all life and goodness and love, and to love each other is a good. But if he forced it, then it's not love. Love by definition is a choice. So the same reason why God can't make a square circle, he can't make a forced love. He can't force love. So the only way to do that was to give him a choice. All right, you're in perfection, you live the perfect human existence, I'm taking care of you, all that stuff, but you need to love me, and the way I know that you'll know you love me is you'll choose, and here are the two trees, and here's how you choose. He could have, I think it's somewhat arbitrary that it was two trees. Could have been anything. It's just that he had to give some, this is what the free will defense says, he had to give some out so that they could freely choose not to take that out. And that means that they did love him. But in order to do that, that meant the possibility of evil and the fall of man had to be there all the time. So the first human sinned, and right away the curse, the plan of salvation, and then we die, and then ultimately the end of all things, and we get our bodies back in an existence that everything's been taken care of. There's no more tree of evil. There's only a tree of life in heaven, in New Jerusalem, because that's already been taken care of. There's a whole bunch of, you can talk to a philosopher about that, and I think it's pretty interesting listening to them why we're still freely choosing to love God in heaven, even though there's no choice of evil at that time. It's because we've already gone through it. That's basically it. That makes the most sense to me. Say that love is a choice, You can't have a choice if there's only one option. He had to do that by definition, because he is who he is. He can't contradict himself. That's why he had to do it. It brings in God's nature and his character, brings in what it means to be a creature made in his image, and also fits the narrative in the story. So, conclusion, so there's a difference between natural and moral evil. Very, I think, important to parse that out to see if someone's talking with you, whether they're giving you an emotional objection or an intellectual objection. Try to say, like, what do you mean? Like the tornado from Monday, or are you talking about a shooter, Columbine shooting, or pick one. You pick the most recent one. Which one are we talking about here? The solution to the problem of evil needs to address both. So I think, as you can see, what we've gone through, it would apply to natural evils like earthquakes and God allowing free choice even today, which means great sin even today. Evil should be understood not as a thing, but as a privation, meaning God is not responsible for creating evil. He created freedom, which by definition needed the possibility of evil. Some solutions to the problem of evil are not compatible with Christianity, meaning God wasn't strong enough or had all knowledge to see it coming. That's not biblical Christianity. That's not the God of classical theism. So we can't use that as an option. There is a rational solution to the problem of evil that is compatible, and I think the 5 options that we went through, and the slides are already done, so you're going to actually have the slides ready tonight. But I think these 5, I think, are the ones that are, know them all, try and learn them all, read some of these books, if this is something that's interesting to you, and I think you'll find all of them satisfying. Like me, you'll probably find some more satisfying than others, but I think they're all, it's a good argument. At the very least, Lord, I know how it's possible that this happened and I'm crying at a funeral. I'm weeping, but I'm not mad at you. Or maybe I am mad at you, but I know deep down. It does help you suffer, I think, better. Now, the kicker then, I like to end with, when I first heard this, I think it was William Lane Craig that pointed this out. The proof of God from evil. So I'm actually going to use evil to prove God's existence the same way we use the cosmological and the creation and all that, and design and the moral argument. So let's do that. Talk to our atheists. Okay, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. So there's no God. You can't really say what Hitler did was wrong, objectively. And remember when we did the third week, the third argument, it was the moral argument. If you remember why that is, if not, go back and look at those. But that's a true statement. Oh, but evil does exist, Hitler. Therefore, objective moral and values do exist, which means you think Hitler's actions were evil, right? Okay, then God exists. So if someone's going to get mad and say there's a problem of evil, what do you mean by evil? If you think evil exists, you can, if you want to, depending on your rapport with them, if they're about to cry or don't do this, but sometimes you can say, evil exists? I agree with you, God exists. Like, what? I didn't say God exists, I said evil exists. Yeah, I agree with you. You're right, God exists. That's the only explanation. And then go through this with them. But you see how that works? Basically, you can't, and I think this is what Darwin was saying, but I don't think he lived consistently with this, because I'm sure he still cried at funerals. Why? Because by your own theory, we're just on this continuum of animals. You look in the animal kingdom and you don't see them crying, and you also don't lament when as much as you think that what's that? I think it's a caterpillar, that there's a wasp that bores into the caterpillar's brain, and it sucks the nutrients out of the brain, but it's in the nerve center that is the pain center of the victim, if you want to call it that. And so what he would say is, I think I'm describing that right. So you at home, if I don't have the species right, the principle is correct. There is a predator that kills its prey that way. How could God make it an animal whose only way of eating, this is design, the animal's not choosing this is design, is to cause great pain and suffering in its victim? That's what that's what Darwin was trying to say. But Darwin, is that evil or just is what it is? So he tried to say therefore humans doing that to each other isn't really evil, it's just us surviving of the fittest. And if you remember the book series that we did, that Screw Up the World, 10 Books that Screw Up the World, certain people like Nietzsche and those who came after Darwin said, yeah, okay, all right, well, you're right. So therefore, survival of the fittest on a social level too. Charity is totally stupid. Why in the world would you? We're the only species that takes the infirm and gives them longer life and allows them to reproduce. Margaret Sanger, the eugenics movement, taking Darwin and saying, yeah, we should make only the best of our genes perpetuate. So forcing people to get sterilized or killing them. That's what happened in the 20th century, right? That's what follows from Darwin. But back up, Darwin, Chuck, do you think this is evil, or just is what it is in the case of the larva? Okay, when you go to a gravesite, do you think this is evil, or just is what it is? You can't have it both ways. If it's evil for the humans, then there's a God. Or this sense that you have, this is what he said in print, that I cry at a funeral is actually natural selection has built that into us so that we protect each other more fervently, and by doing that we perpetuate the people who have protected their offspring more fervently because they don't want to cry, pass on that gene which makes them not want to cry more efficiently than the ones who are like whatever and their kids die more easily. Then obviously they don't go on. That's what he would argue is this is just natural selection kind of tricking us into thinking we're sad right now, and it has a survival benefit. So you either have to say that or that God exists. And if it's an illusion, the best thing you should do as a person who thinks it's an illusion is be a Buddhist maybe. Figure out that this is not real. All the suffering that we're talking about is an illusion. I need to fight this. I need to fight resist this urge to think that my mourning is real and is true. Nobody wants to live in that existence, even if they say they do. But force them to see that you have to accept that. And as it stands, next Tuesday night, one of our professors, who I don't think you guys have seen yet, I wanted to get him in here, Brian Huffling, he's debating what's his name? I don't have it on here. A guy wrote a book, a philosopher. Remember earlier I said that most philosophers don't want to go as far as to say it's logically impossible for God to exist and evil and suffering to exist. It's impossible logically. Most non-Christian philosophers will say it's improbable or unlikely that God exists, but they realize that there's no law of logic that's being broken. This guy is gutsy. He's saying it's illogical. So he wrote a book, and we called him, and he's going to debate our professor on whether or not that's true. So if you're interested in that, it's at Winthrop, so it's a little bit of a drive over in South Carolina, but not terrible. It's next Tuesday night, which is why Adam can't be here next week, because he's going to be at that, helping host it, and he doesn't want to do 2 nights away from home. So, and once it's available, we'll post it on the SES, or the SES, but also on our classes website. If you're interested, take a look at that. So, any questions? Did I swim too far into the deep end of philosophy? You guys are
I'd like to ask
tracking.
a question. I'm hoping I can ask it in a way that makes sense. So, in my, I understand God wants how He used freedom. He wants, and the only way we can have love is to be free, and it's just a necessity.
Yeah.
But yet we read so I'm trying to look into the nature of God, and we know the attributes of God. They're very helpful, but just trying to
meditate on them more?
Yeah, meditate. So, in Revelation 21, when we're talking about after the millennium, Revelation 21, there'll be no more crying, no more weeping, no more pain.
Mm-hmm.
So, in heaven, this thing that we have here on earth that allows us to love, which is
The choice.
the choice, it almost seems like in heaven, and which is maybe what God really intended, and this is weird for us, that's not going to be there in heaven, because there's no more pain, there's no more crying.
seems there would be no more consequences.
Right,
like
so
what they're saying there.
are we talking, I mean, and we know God's the same, he's not gonna change.
Mhm.
I mean,
And we can't change in our nature, otherwise we'll be a different thing, right?
so what's
human
going on
nature
there?
is
That this thing that allows us to love is gonna be gone. I mean, it seems like it's gonna be gone in heaven.
a real philosopher, somebody who does that for a living, it will be better to explain it. But this is what I've gleaned from that question, because I asked that too. Number one, it's not really heaven you're talking about there. You're talking about the new earth
That's right.
and the new creation.
That's right.
And there's a book called Heaven by Randy Alcorn, which is not a philosophy book, but he just goes through all the passages in the Bible that have to do with our new, what life will be like in that state. And he just has fun with it. He's like, hey, it says this, well, let's think about what that would mean day to day. So you start to get a sense of like, there's not entirely continuity between our life now and our life then, because creation itself, some Christians think that God destroys the universe and rebuilds from scratch. I think he just redeems this one probably, because Jerusalem is still a place, but I don't know that it really matters either way on that one. But I know people get pretty heated about did God destroy it or not. I don't know. It doesn't matter for this question. It's a physical existence is the important thing. We all get our bodies back and we live with him forever. Now you think about Jesus' body, there was some continuity between his pre-death and his resurrection body, but not entirely, because his wounds, for example, were healed up, but there were scars. But it was only a couple days, so obviously that's not, there's something going on there that isn't what his old body would have done. Also, they're in a locked room, and he appears, and then he's gone. The room's still locked. Okay, can we disapparate and walk through walls or whatever? We don't know. Maybe if that's what a resurrection body is like in this current creation, or maybe in the new creation, what Randy Alcorn was saying is, maybe we're able to like zip wherever we want. Hey, let's go see the Andromeda Galaxy. That's cool. Let's go. God, you have eternity to explore his creation, is what he's saying. Maybe that's what it'll be. And so the physical laws are different. If you look at the descriptions of the new earth, it seems like things are radically different. So the physical laws that are set up for us to be able to choose one or the other will be not present, although it seems like we can still eat, because Jesus in his resurrection body ate fish. I don't know, it just blows your mind. The simple way of saying it is, our life experience there is only analogous to our life now. It's not a one-to-one. We're different. We don't lose our human nature, because we have to remain us. We don't lose our individuality. We know that because Moses and Elijah were Moses and Elijah. And the rich man and Lazarus were the rich man and Lazarus in heaven and in hell. You maintain who you are in the afterlife and in the new earth. But you're not going to be like you are now. Exactly. So all we can say is, I know enough to know that there's not a logical contradiction. I don't know how that's going to cash out. The answer to the question of, if there's no choice to not love God, how can it be called love? It's called the beatific vision, and it means that there's no gap between you as a creature and your creator, and you know him perfectly. And some people go as far as to say that state, you are in a trance. It's so good that you don't even care about. So they'll answer like, what about, you'll know that people are in hell if you still have memories, your loved ones that are in hell, won't that be sad? They say you won't care because you have this beatific vision, you see God in all his glory and all his goodness. They go as far as to say you're not even aware of the person to your left and your right because they're doing the same thing. I don't think that's right, because it says so many things about us having fellowship in heaven, us being together with our loved ones in heaven. And if it was like you could care less about them because you're connected with God so tightly, then why would he have all these encouraging things to tell us about? You're going to see him again. You'll be with them. So I think the beatific vision means you are so connected with him. The idea of sinning is preposterous. There's just no sin. Are you crazy? We just went through the whole human history. No way. Not even an option. So it's still freely chosen, but sort of like we tried that plan. It didn't work. Not even tempting to me So maybe you could say it's logically possible, but not actually possible for anyone to sin ever again at that point. Those are some of the things that they've said. Now, there are deep philosophical explanations underneath each of those, beatific vision and all that. But that's how I understand what they've told me, and they say, yeah, that's roughly it. So it depends how Thomistic somebody gets, kind of, I think, a little too mystical with the beatific vision, what it is, because of, like I said, you maintain who you are up there.
But
So I would recommend that.
isn't like knowledge added though, in the sense that now we see as through a glass darkly or whatever, or stained glass?
The question is,
we
what is that
see-
verse talking about?
Not true.
But yeah, we see dimly, then we'll see clearly.
See and kind of understand or know as we are known.
And what proponents of this thing called beatific vision, I honestly don't know where Baptists fall on that. I don't think this is talked about much in evangelical circles, but this is very compatible with, we're going to be face to face. This is how we usually talk about face to face with God. And it even says face to face in 1 Corinthians 13. But they would say that that's what the beatific vision is. We will know truly or perfectly, if the word is, just as we are perfectly known. So right now, God knows you perfectly. You're going to know him perfectly, but not entirely because he's infinite.
Yeah, he's infinite. I
So-
know, but could we not know each other perfectly? Like even your own past experiences, everything about you, but with that understanding that God has of seeing you as you are,
Right.
and loving you.
And that's that. And Randy Alcorn, I recommend the book because he says just gonna have some fun with this. Are we gonna sit around chatting about old times? Are we gonna? He says, here are some verses, and here, let's say you can. Then you have an eternity to be like, hey, I'm gonna go talk to C.S. Lewis. Man, my whole life we did nothing but talk about you. I want to hang out for 100 years with C.S. Lewis, and it's no skin off his back because it's 100 years in eternity, right? And the line isn't really out the door because everybody can get 100 years of them, and it won't matter. That I like that idea because fellowship, and both of you are interacting with each other with perfect communion with your God, and so it's like it's awesome. And that also is answering, I think, the question: people we've sinned against who have gone on, and we never got a chance to reconcile with them. Are they going to be ticked at us? Are they going to be? Clearly, we know they won't.
Again, that
but-
goes back to the understanding that God sees that you have that perfect understanding from them, and you know why they did what they did exactly. Same
Exactly,
vice versa.
and they remember. I think that we'll remember that we were sinners before, even if we're not experiencing it in heaven. Yeah, man, that was so bad. I'm so glad we're past that. I know all that now. I know all the things I did I wasn't even aware of to hurt you, and you don't even say you're sorry in heaven. There are no more tears. See you, man. See you next week.
Yep.
All these things are speculation because, ironically, the Bible says very little about our day-to-day experiences of heaven. It says a lot about heaven, the kingdom of heaven. Jesus talks about all the time. What is that going to mean, like day-to-day? Will there even be a day-to-day? Because it says there's no more night. Light coming from the throne room, from Jerusalem, right? Streets are emanating light. It's a lot of cool imagination. Just know your Bible well enough and your philosophy well enough to know when you've said something wrong and say, okay, not that, I'll back up a little bit. But we can't be so heavenly minded that we're not perfectly good. I like meditating on it to get excited and have peace and comfort, especially after a funeral, or saying goodbye to someone. It's a good time to meditate on these things. But then just get right back to, I'm here now, and God, you haven't taken me home yet, so obviously I have more to do, so let's get it going. So,
Just thinking about his original intention and those kind of things. What he really,
except we don't want to say that he changed his intention but yeah, the original design of the universe was a certain way, and it was cursed afterwards. It couldn't have been radically changed because it wouldn't be the same thing, but he cursed things. And that's not a minor thing, that's intense. Cursing is intense. Death and pain and thorns and thistles and personal relationship issues now. I mean, that's what he says, what your desire will be for your husband. What most scholars think that means is it's not just that you'll desire him physically, it's your desire will be for your husband's leadership. Because you, Eve, you weren't supposed to be the one in control. And Adam, this is totally a side note too, but it's really fascinating. There's a book called The Silence of Adam. And if you read the narrative in the third chapter, she's getting tempted and he's misquoting God slightly, just really slightly misquoting it. If you go back into the first 2 chapters, Eve was not created yet when God said, these are the rules. Adam was created, he got those rules, and he was supposed to be the leader in the relationship. In not a domineering sense, obviously they were sinless. But the narrative, it says that Satan's misrepresenting what God said, and then she takes a bite and turns to Adam, who was with her, and gives it to him. He was standing there the whole time and said nothing. And the book, The Silence of Adam, is saying that was his original sin. Not, he wasn't making a theological point. He's like, Adam should have been like, whoa, 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 no, Eve, that's not exactly what God said, that we can't even touch it or that day we'll die or whatever. He just said that this is the one that we eat if we want life, and this one will bring death. You know, he could have corrected Satan's deception, but he didn't. So the curse seems to be, Eve, your sin was you were taking control of the relationship. Adam, your sin was you were staying silent. Eve, from now on, relationally, you guys are going to have trouble because you're going to be struggling with wanting to be the leader, and he's going to be struggling with not wanting to be the leader, but you're designed to be this way, and it's going to be miserable for you if you don't act the right way. And how many of us can just say, yeah, still don't have it right? Yep, that's why marriage counseling exists. And the book Silence of Adam is written by a counselor, Larry Crabb. So it's him trying to be theological and practical. And it makes the most sense of everything that I've read. And again, I've talked to like Barry Leventhal and other Old Testament scholars, and I'm like, here's what he says. What do you think of that? Is that, yeah. He says, I asked Tom Howe the same thing. He says that's a very legitimate interpretation of it. If you look at all the scriptures about marriage and all that. It's interesting. Another side note, but that's what happened at the curse. Those changes, those curses, not radical changes. Women didn't cease being women, men didn't cease being men. Because it's interesting, it says that I will increase your birth pains. Meaning there was something that was called pain. How can that be if it's perfect? Well, it wasn't the kind of pain that you experience now. We hear. We don't know anything about it. I understand that it's very painful.
Pretty bad.
It wouldn't be anywhere near that.
Except kidney stones.
Right. That's what people have said, right?
Somebody
Women who
else
have
said
had both, they've said, I don't know which one's worse. Yeah, because there's not an epidural for kidney stones, right? So anyway, that's, all this stuff kind of works together. Yeah, like,
If the epidural works, mine did not work.
I've heard, yeah, or it stops working midway.
I had 3 of them, they didn't work.
Jenny tried, we tried the natural way, and midwife and everything, but it was at a hospital, and I said, I'm not doing it. Sorry if anyone's into that kind of thing. I said, no. Thousands and thousands of years of medical advance, I want to take advantage of that.
Yep.
And sure enough, she and David would have died if we weren't in the hospital, because David was stuck in the canal. They couldn't get him to progress, so they had to go in after him. So I was glad I mean, we could have maybe rushed to the hospital in time, but you don't know, And the same thing with my niece. My first niece, cord was around her neck, and she was dying. And both my sister and my niece would have died if it wasn't for a C-section. So I'm pretty pro-medicine and pro-science.
Go to the hospital.
Yeah. So anyway, but isn't it satisfying that the problem of evil, the cosmological, the moral argument, biblical studies, these things we're talking about, interpersonal, it all kind of wraps together when you take this classical view of God and Christianity. Classical theism, everything kind of falls into place without having to arbitrarily force it in. I love that about it. The more I learn, the more I'm like, hey, this really works. See you next week.